panel here. So we would like to welcome you all, dear representatives from the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, the dear representatives from the civil society, resident coordinator, colleagues from the United Nations. Welcome to this side event, which is entitled Towards an Inclusive and Sustainable Recovery from COVID-19, Rights, Needs, and Contributions of Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is a co-organized event by the Office of Coordination of the United Nations and the Caribbean and ICLAC. So the purpose of today's event is to try and defend the effects of COVID-19 on indigenous peoples and to highlight the recovery that they can have given the situation of the COVID-19 and the economic situation too. But before actually beginning, we would like to take a look at the original agenda because some minor adjustments have been made. We're going to start with some opening remarks from Raúl García Buchaca, Executive Secretary of the program at CEPAL, also continued by Christian Salazar Volkman, Regional Director of the United Nations Development Coordination. We will then have His Excellency David Conchehuanca Céspedes, Vice President of the Plurinational State of Bolivia, who will share his reflections on the situation of the indigenous peoples given the pandemic. We will also have Angela Acevedo Huertas, Vice Minister of the Interculturality Minister of Peru, who will talk about the indigenous people in Peru, responses and challenges. We also have the pleasure of listening to Dania C. Perez, coordinator of the Indigenous Youth and SDG program of the technical team of the Fund of the Development of Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean, who will be talking about fostering dialogue and social inclusion with young indigenous people. Then we will hear two coordinators, Rebecca Arias, a coordinator from Guatemala, United Nations, who will talk about the experience of the United Nations and the consultation of indigenous peoples in the analysis and the cooperation framework and the role that they have played given the pandemic. And also Jessica Fayeta, United Nations resident coordinator in Colombia, who will talk about the joint trinational program on COVID-19 response for indigenous people in the Amazon. We will end with Mr. Pablo Sar, who is the director of CELADE, who will give some closing remarks together with Mr. Christian Salazar. Since it's a 1 hour event, we would like to ask you, all the members of the panel, to please stick to the allocated time when you have your presentation. So without further ado, let me pass on the floor to Mr. Raúl García Buchaca. His Excellency, Mr. David Cochehuanca Céspedes, Vice President of the Plurinational State of Bolivia. Ms. Angela Acevedo Huertas, Vice Minister of Interculturality of Peru. Ms. Dalí Ángel Pérez, Coordinator of the Indigenous Youth Program and ODS of the technical team of the Fund for the Development of Indigenous People in Latin America and the Caribbean. Christian Salazar, Regional Director of the United Nations Development Coordination Office, Rebecca Arias, and Jessica Fayeta, coordinators, residents of the United Nations in Guatemala and Colombia, respectively. Paulo Saad, Director of CELADE, dear authorities of the government, representatives of indigenous people, dear colleagues and friends. Good afternoon. For me, it is a great honor and pleasure to be here with you today on behalf of the Executive Secretary Alicia Bárcena, who sends a very fraternal and affectionate greeting. I would like to thank, or I would like to greet in particular, the Vice President Choquehuanca. Alicia apologizes because she's in the plenary now, acting as a moderator. But I also want to thank the participation of every single one of you on this side event, the main objective of which is to analyze how we can accelerate the process of inclusion of the indigenous people of Latin America and the Caribbean in the implementation of the commitments established in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And for this, it is crucial to resume the centrality of human rights in the light of the impacts of the pandemic of the COVID-19, and to consider again the roadmap and the standards contained in the Declaration of the United Nations on the Convention of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the agreements of the World Conference on Indigenous People. It is estimated that at present, the indigenous population of Latin America reaches 60 million people, with the existence of more than 800 very diverse people from the demographic, territorial, cultural, and socio-political point of view. However, as a result of a long and complex historical process, our indigenous peoples today suffer so much more, emphasize the structural inequalities, the discrimination and racism that unfortunately characterizes our region, and also faces a scenario of a greater vulnerability risks against the pandemic of the COVID-19 and the impacts of the health, economic, and social crisis. The persistence of a pattern of a higher incidence of poverty among our indigenous people have been documented in multiple reports. And just to mention one, it is the Social Panorama of ECLAC 2019, where it is stated that in that year, the poverty rate of indigenous people rose to 46.7%, and extreme poverty 17.3%, which represents a magnitude that is double and triple, respectively, the comparable rates of the general non-indigenous and non-Afro-descendant population in the group of the 9 countries that the information is available from. The COVID-19 pandemic has produced differentiated and intersectional effects on the enjoyment of the rights to health and life of indigenous people, as well as other dimensions of economic, social, cultural, territorial, and environmental rights, which affect so much more women and children and young people, as well as the elderly and people with disabilities belonging to these peoples. And along with these, the tensions and conflicts derived from the lack of guarantees of the territorial rights of indigenous peoples and the external threats that have continued to increase very notoriously. All of this has been documented in our recent report entitled The Impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous Peoples of Latin America, Abjayala, Between Invisibility and Collective Resistance, which was put together jointly by the agencies that make up the interagency group on indigenous peoples of our region. In this report, we found that in 5 countries that account for 80% of the region's indigenous people, Chile, Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, and Peru, more than 8 million people belonging to these indigenous peoples experience lack of access to drinking water, in housing, limited access to basic sanitation services, and higher levels of overcrowding, which oftentimes makes it impossible to adopt basic prevention measures to avoid infection and to have an appropriate confinement pandemic context. And although we do not have enough information to know how these vulnerabilities interact, given the expansion and the spread of infections among indigenous people. The empirical evidence gathered in that document shows prevalence and lethality rate affecting indigenous peoples and some of its territories which rise well above national averages. Faced with this often bleak outlook, the weak state response, it is also necessary to recognize that indigenous peoples have carried out a series of actions in order to resist the pandemic, which, although they contribute to buffer the impact of the health crisis on the territories, the truth is that the figures still flash on some warning lights on the need to undertake special actions which are much more decisive decisive and supportive in order to achieve the necessary territorial recovery on these large populations living in the cities. Undoubtedly, the 2030 Agenda constitutes a great opportunity to pay off the historical debts that states have with indigenous peoples, provided that proper harmonization between the SDGs and the collective rights of indigenous peoples are guaranteed. Only this way will the commitment to ensure that no one is left behind will be a reality for these peoples. And now, in closing, let me just express our deepest conviction from ICLAC that in the recovery process of this crisis, we can never lose of sight the historical resilience that characterizes indigenous peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, who have been able to resist and overcome cyclical crisis from the arrivals of the conquerors, and we cannot overlook the fact that they have a wealth of knowledge and traditional knowledge that includes the protection of biodiversity, their own health and food systems, as well as the genuinely sustainable economies. This cannot be ignored. All of this can contribute very significantly, not only to build successful responses to the pandemic and their consequences in the midterm, but also to help us to rethink a new style of development that really proves to be sustainable, inclusive, diverse, multicultural, and equality as the main focus. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Buchaca. We will now leave the floor to Mr. Christian Salazar Volkmann. Well, Raul has already established the protocol, and I would just like to thank the Vice President for his presence here. Also, Vice Minister, it is an honor for us to have you with us. Thank you, Jessica and Rebecca, the representatives from Colombia, Guatemala, Dalia Angel, also we've shared before. And I would like to thank you all. Good afternoon, everybody. And we, at the United Nations, for decades have been close partners to the indigenous people. Globally speaking, in the supporting the declaration in collaboration with the permanent forum, but also in our region, FAO, FIA, UN Women, UNDP, ECLAC, among many others that for decades have developed programs to provide support to indigenous peoples, defending and advocating their rights. So we believe that today it is one additional possibility to show within the forum of ICLAC that the light is shed on the most extensive crisis that we've had in our region for a decade, the situation of indigenous peoples. So the only thing that I really want to say, because we're going to start delving into the topics with the presentations from the Vice President and the Vice Minister, that in our recovery, socioeconomic recovery plan, in all of the countries where there are indigenous populations, which are almost all of them, we have included special measures to access to basic services, multilingual, multiculturally, regarding the COVID, but we've gotten together with all of the leaders, with representatives from these peoples in the region, and they have asked us for more support in the dialogue between government and indigenous peoples on how that recovery process is going to be, because apparently there's not much dialogue regarding that, looking for trying to address the concern that indigenous leaders and indigenous peoples have. This is a topic that is not new, but it is still very important, and not to forget the free prior consultation, especially when the pressure for economic growth could have a negative impact on the respect of the rights of indigenous peoples and their lands. So today we will know some measures and some approaches, and we are very grateful for the members of the panel, for their contributions, for everyone listens. And since we don't have a lot of time, I will give the floor back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Christian. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to His Excellency, the Vice President, because we know he can't stay during the whole event. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My greetings to all of you, to all of us here and those who are not here. This is a code of the Vidil-Vim, which means obligation to communicate, obligation to dialogue. They say that after COVID-19, nothing will be the same, and nothing has to be the same. Everywhere, in several spaces, academic, social, they speak about new normal. It's okay. This new normal has to be devised by us, by our peoples, with the participation of everyone. That new normal doesn't need to be imposed anymore. And we are all obliged to think, after coronavirus, of a very deep transformation of the order that prevails, which is in the center periphery political system, which is already in a crisis by the falling apart of the unipolar world. It keeps promoting very deep inequalities in the world. All of this reasserts a very concerning diagnosis that makes us think about the need we have to promote a world that is centered in the respect for life and nature, respect for our Mother Earth as a necessary condition for survival of the mankind. The pandemic we are suffering corroborates such a diagnosis that the peoples of the world make. The global richness forced by capitalism has never been and will never be democratic. Its own logic of accumulation is concentric, and it deprives common goods. So it shows it as it is, an economy that only knows how to produce by destroying. So life has become fragile because what should be enjoyment of production through distribution only causes destruction and poverty. And that is what makes poor people more vulnerable vis-a-vis coronavirus and other viral diseases, which have spreading suspiciously together with the more power obtained by the pharma industry, which seems not to be interested in the diseases of people anymore. The most vulnerable ones turn out to be those who are forgotten in our countries, amongst them the indigenous peoples that live in this planet. A quarantine that has just corroborated how far world protocols are from our realities. All of this has left the most vulnerable defenseless. That's why we call attention to the protocols of health in Bolivia and in our region. What they did was just increase poverty and take people to economic ruin of our countries and cornering all of us to the bleeding of an avoidable debt. The right to health was even more affected because of this new virus. None of the measures to contain the pandemic have taken into account our realities. Conversely, measures have shown the continuity of a policy of denial, exclusion, and extermination, which has been eugenic, something that is in the minds of those who decide, those who have the power, who lives and who dies. The pandemic seems to be a very good excuse to rid countries from responsibility. And the economic crisis is not only attributable to the coronavirus, but it is something that comes from the past. The pandemic has been used to um, cause the mobilization of indigenous communities. It has affected our productive system, our supply chains. So for us, wisdom and knowledge of nature through our plants, medicines, food, all of this has been the instrument whereby once more we have resisted. As indigenous people, we propose a new world economic system which has to be constructed not only based on the needs of capital and the global market, but it has to guarantee the life of humanity and also a restoration of the conditions for nature to reproduce. For us, nature is subject, mother. So our life, its sons and daughters, is only possible if we affirm its life. A lot is being said about an intelligent economy. Well, you can only be really intelligent if you respect the source from where our life comes. You cannot ignore something basic. The reason is not supported by itself. What supports everything is life. So if you do not ensure life itself, nothing can be certain. The common goods can only be subject to democratization, distribution. In that sense, the terms development, sustainable patterns of consumption and production, restoration, regeneration of environmental actions, all of this should have a different meaning. And from where we can have a different common sense in accordance with this symbiotic cycle, which is established in a complementary manner between human beings and nature. It is not the economic growth which guarantees human rights and rights of Mother Earth, but the horizon of a fair life requires redistribution, democratic redistribution of wealth, and it be dignified to propel an economy that doesn't produce more poor people or excluded or marginalized, as it happens in an economy of giants, which is oriented to a concentric accumulation of capital and expansion of the global market. The true producers of wealth require a fairer, distribution of the means to develop our cultural capacities, besides the opportunity to play an important role in the transformation of the system in order to have a new economy for life, full enjoyment of services, health, education, constituted as human rights and democratic access to knowledge and technology in accordance to life, not gain to help the creation of a more solidarity, work with more solidarity and non-inclusive. We have resisted all of the pests, which as a biological war, we have suffered from something that modernity has promoted as an experiment, but our wisdom has learned how to be patient, examining our most sacred aspect, the spirit of our ancestors. With that, we remember we are the culture of life. We are creators, viviris y coliris, healers. We're called the moral reserve of mankind because we know we are sons and daughters of Mother Earth. We consider creators of the life and the economy. We propose politics, science, technology, etc., is conceived in order to restore, renovate, create life itself. We allow to increase appropriate policies and all of the global actions that are necessary to prevent and avoid the depletion of regenerative capacities of nature, assuming that our life depends on the sustainability of the reproductive capacity of the life systems of Mother Earth and comprehensive and sustainable management of its components. This crisis has to be an opportunity for all, not only for the indigenous peoples. It is not just up to indigenous peoples, but this is an opportunity for indigenous, non-indigenous, for the blacks, the whites. We have to start taking care of life. We have to start taking care of our Mother Earth. And we say this is a great opportunity to go back to the path of balance, to go back to respect for the wind, respect for our mountains, for our plants, bees, rivers, respect for fire, respect for our Mother Earth, respect for the sovereignty of our peoples. This has to be an opportunity to go back to become a human being that is part and parcel of nature. We stopped being that. Now is the time to be like that again, to go back to the big family. Because indigenous, blacks and whites, we are part of a great family. There is a principle summoning us in order to come back. Tama. Tama, great family. Brethren, brothers and sisters, this new normal has to be to establish a harmonious relationship. Human beings, nature. Hayaya, peoples of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice President, for such a deep and a powerful speech on the relationship between health, poverty, culture, social services, and how we can move forward with a completely different approach. Very grateful then for your words and for your reflections. And hopefully you'll be able to stay for a little while longer with us. And if not, well, we understand that you have a busier agenda. Let me now give the floor to Angela Acevedo for her reflections from Peru. Yes, good afternoon, and thank you, everybody, for having invited me. I would like to start this reflection. I would like to start this debate by mentioning something that has affected us all. In Peru, it is now 1 year since the initial lockdown and the initial measures that were taken within the whole context of the pandemic. And we know that this pandemic has had quite an important and serious impact on indigenous people. So I have put together reflections on three main areas. The first one is how are we? That is to say, the diagnosis. And then what I would have to show there is to acknowledge the historical debt that governments, in this case, the government of Peru, has towards our indigenous people. We're talking about 55 indigenous people, 4.5 million people that are self identified as indigenous, 48 different indigenous tongues. It's quite a diverse country with different languages, dialogues, cultures, and a deep, important traditional knowledge. And it is the indigenous people that have the biggest lacks of access to public services, health, water, education. It's where the largest inequalities are concentrated. Just let me show you some examples. In 2009, the prevalence of anemia on children between 6 and 36 months of people or these children that were born from mothers that talked an indigenous language was 52%, and the national average was 38%. In Peru, also given the measurement from the WHO, 19% of children whose mothers taught them an indigenous language were smaller. The national size of the children was smaller, and the national average is only 12%. And I can show you countless figures that go to show that indigenous people were already in disadvantage before the pandemic. It is also true that in the last few years, we've had important progress made regarding the guarantees of indigenous peoples, the political recognition, for example, of indigenous peoples. 10 years ago, discussing about indigenous peoples in the public policies, saying that there were indigenous people in some areas in our country was something that simply was not accepted in when putting together public policies. And today, that's no longer a topic of discussion. In the last few years, we were able to include the self identification question of being part of an indigenous people in order to have a truly updated information to put together different policies. We've also made progress in the identity documents, the DNI, as we know it here in Peru. Only 5% of indigenous people do not have access to their national ID, which is a relatively good figure, much lower than many other in the country. Also, a response of children, in response to children in 2019, a budget program was approved for early childhood development, articulated the work on health and education in order to have comprehensive full development of their education. Now, in spite of this historical debt and the efforts that have been undertaken from the last governments to change the situation, the pandemic came on to us in 2019. COVID-19, when we were at the beginning of this discussion, presented two very complicated situations. First, lack of information, how to fight against it, what medications, general information regarding the pandemic, and also how to bridge these historical gaps in order to provide better service for the indigenous people. In Peru, we worked last year mostly on a special strategy for indigenous people, approved with standards and regulations with five pillars: food or supply, given the lockdown; special health; isolated peoples; security and safety; and an information and early warning system. These were the five different angles: how to work on the situation that I've already given you the context, and how to make progress. So, given this strategy, I would like to highlight three things. First of all, health. For the very first time, a special budget was approved for the indigenous people of the Amazonas. We know the situation of the whole Peruvian public health system. And that is why, aside from the measures that are taken for normal citizens, there's a special budget with special teams to go to the faraway places. Information and early warning system. One of the big things that we are all going through is the lack of information, and a lot of the information that's available is not always true. What it has been come to be known as fake news. And in the case of indigenous people, this was even more complicated because we indigenous people were talking, don't forget, about 48 different dialogues. So any measure that is taken has got to be adapted to the cultural context of our indigenous people, which implies not only their language, but also respect for their culture. Let me give you an example. Last year, when we were discussing the measures for the lockdown, when we say stay at home, when we talk about indigenous people, you cannot stay at home. You're not just part of your community, given the cultural practices that these people have. So those measures need to be specially worked with indigenous people. So there was a specific system applied together with the Ministry of Culture and also with the mass media in order to try and reach the largest number of communities in rural areas. We've been working with Indigenous Association and also in cooperation with others. And thirdly, one of the things that we saw was necessary was to have an articulation or coordination. When working with indigenous people, it is important to work in coordination, trying to really bring the comments that are made, the contributions that are made from the different organizations. So a multi-sectorial group was put together where the different national organizations participated to discuss the measures and to see what further measures were needed, not only at the national level. We also established spaces for the coordination at the regional level. That is to say, closer to their territories with the presence of the regional governments and representatives of the different indigenous peoples in those regions. And that presented special or specific measures that needed to be developed and that are being developed. And lastly, we believe that the pandemic, and the Bolivian vice president was saying, has can also be seen as an opportunity for change. We are well aware that our indigenous people have the largest inequalities, and if we really want to talk about a different democracy, we have to talk about the need for a change. And let me establish 4 points here. First of all, how can we bridge these inequalities? How can we have access to public services that are fully efficiently? Because it's not just reaching them with the healthcare, with the vaccination, or with the medication or education. It is getting to them with an appropriate public service for these indigenous citizens in their language, respecting their culture, respecting their institutions. Secondly, the need to recognize their representative organizations. And that's a big challenge for the state and the different levels in government because it means adapting our bureaucracy and to be in constant coordination with indigenous people, and it forces a dialogue. 169 establishes, well, the prior consultation, but also an ongoing conversation involving them in policies that impact them. So if we're talking about change, we have to start from these two cornerstones in order to implement any public policy. Thirdly, we need to acknowledge that the countries, and let me talk about Latin America in general here, are in different situations, given the whole situation of the pandemic when compared against other countries. And the whole access to vaccination is evidence of this. This requires coordination, support from north to south, south to north, different governments in order to have a more effective access to vaccinations. And lastly, if we're talking about the possibility and the need of change in order to have a different democracy, where our indigenous people should have a voice, we need to work jointly. Governments, indigenous peoples, public and private sector. The pandemic has come to show us that we cannot do this by ourselves. We have to work in coordination, put ourselves in the others' shoes, truly seeing, truly respecting an intercultural approach, understanding our Peruvian people in this particular case, and how, in coordination, we can truly achieve these changes that are highly necessary. Thank you. That was excellent, especially considering the structural changes, the progress that have been made given the COVID or the pandemic situation on the indigenous people, and some of the measures that Peru has taken in order to address these impacts. That has been an excellent recommendation. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. So I will now leave the floor to Dalia Angel for us to share her presentation.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the invitation made by ECLAC and the Office of Development Coordination. And it's also an honor to hear the Vice President of the plurinational state of Bolivia. Before the pandemic, the response of indigenous people have been varied, not only content, but also the way it's been expressed. The youth has been affected, particularly indigenous youth. Youngsters, besides collaborating through collective efforts, they have organized and started specific actions to combat COVID-19. In order to understand the realities of indigenous peoples, we have to take into account the cultural diversity of indigenous people, their part, and the systems they have. Identity is so important for indigenous people. They have an individual component incorporated to the territory and tradition of peoples. The current situation requires intercultural and intergenerational solutions where indigenous youth are taking into account for economic, social elements. Now, I'm going to share some examples of the actions of different indigenous peoples, some as part of initiatives and others in some countries of the region. We have a young Zapoteco who comes from the photographic area in Zapahuaca, Latin America. This nursery process deals with the violence. So from art They try to deal with collective violence. The premise is to act from the community, from the daily activities. Participants were a part of narrative workshops, and also they went around the community with cameras. There was a photo challenge that lasted for 40 days. Participants had to take pictures daily with cell phones, and that material was going to be shared. So the photography is something used for the fabric of the society that COVID-19 has destroyed. The other thing was, what do you want to do if COVID ends today? A photographic campaign was done with lots of people from the civil society and helped deal with emotional conflicts as a result of the lockdowns. There were also some digital posters by FILAC. Some indigenous peoples from Navia Yala presented works based on the promotion of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, traditional medicine, indigenous languages, in order to face the pandemic. One of the works awarded was Flor de Maria Arango from the Quechua people in Peru. The poster doesn't only show the textiles, but health and medicine and the importance of food in order to strengthen the immune system to face different diseases, amongst them COVID-19, that is hitting the world. From very old times, thanks to culturing potato, maize, quinoa, barley, etc., her parents and ancestors were able to survive thanks to Pachamama. In the context of health crisis, music and art of young indigenous people becomes a cultural production that allows to deal with the effects of the pandemic, strengthen all of those struggles in the lockdowns. For example, in Guatemala, the young indigenous man developed an artistic repertoire that is shared by other indigenous peoples in different territories that are trying to promote the defense of their territory vis-a-vis the extractivistic exploitation. Also, loss of identity, globalization, technologies, and indigenous language, with an art of being able to strengthen cultural aspects, identity aspects, and also language, which are fundamental to face the pandemic. Indigenous youth provide essential contributions to solve the problems in our communities. So from FILAC, we keep supporting them with these initiatives, which guarantee the intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Indigenous youth are very clear that without prejudice of continuing with their actions, they require a public policy and institutional framework that lays the foundations in order to move forward. In other aspects, full access of indigenous communities to internet should be given, which reduces the technological gap that exists today. Last but not least, we have to perform necessary actions to have legal safety in terms of the lands of indigenous people, to have sustainable activities which are in line with the cosmovision of old and new generations. Programs are necessary to allow access for projects for different developments, technical assistance, and access to markets with a special care to use of traditional elements that are accessible for youngsters and women. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daliangel. Thank you for speaking about the importance of intergenerational transmission, how fundamental culture is in order to be able to face crisis, transfer of knowledge, and also have institutional frameworks that allow to improve access to services, including access to technology, which is something that was mentioned a lot this morning, the technological gap, which is so fundamental for youngsters. Well, now, thank you very much for your participation. Now I'm going to give the floor to Rebecca Arias. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. It is an honor to be participating in this panel. Thanks to the members of the panel and all of you who are listening to us. I would like to use a PowerPoint presentation. Please let me know if you can see it.
Ahora sí. ¿Está?
Now we can see it. All right. First, I'm going to share with you about the consultation process by indigenous peoples in Guatemala regarding the new cooperation framework of the UN and its role in the recovery from COVID and the process of recovery regarding COVID-19. First, I want to mention that the situation of indigenous peoples in Guatemala, just like in other Latin American countries, is exclusion and gap, development gap. But it is the majority population, almost 44% declares as indigenous population according to the last census. So indigenous populations face structural challenges to guarantee the full respect of their human rights and development. We see that in Guatemala, poverty has an indigenous face. Poverty affects mostly the indigenous population. 4 out of 5 indigenous people are living in a situation of poverty, and extreme poverty has increased in the 5 years. That increase was twice as much in the indigenous populations as compared to the non-indigenous population. The multi-dimensional poverty index shows that indigenous people suffer systematically more deprivations than the rest of the population. Chronic malnutrition, a big problem for Guatemala. 47% of children under 5 years old have chronic malnutrition. For indigenous people, for indigenous children, that accounts for 60%. Regarding the literacy rates, they are lower in the indigenous populations compared to the indigenous population. Regarding public expense, it is less, it's half of the expenditure spent in the rest of the population. This shows the exclusion of indigenous population. Well, just one thing. Sometimes we can't hear you. Maybe I should speak closer to the mic. All right. Regarding the impact of COVID-19 in indigenous populations, this has been a very difficult situation because indigenous people have had very important shortages. So in order to respond to COVID as UN system, we started by listening to indigenous people. We started to listen to their proposals, not only needs and demands, but their proposals to define their response in relation to the impact of COVID-19. Traditionally, the UN has worked with indigenous populations. Important programs have been implemented in the different sectors in indigenous communities to promote development of indigenous peoples, social economics, social development, political participation, protection of the environment. So this is a relationship that is long-standing. It is a relationship that you have to keep building. You have to build trust with indigenous peoples. In that sense, the UN system has considered indigenous peoples as a priority. So in this Sustainable Development Framework 2020-2025, we have included rights of indigenous peoples and full development of indigenous peoples within this framework. And in that way, in this process, we did a lot of consultation with different sectors, government, civil society, women's organizations, and representatives from indigenous peoples, so as to consider their proposals. The 5 pillars of this framework include some specific strategies to promote development of indigenous peoples and the respect for their rights. So their suggestions were included, not 100%, but largely, as you know, this is a negotiation that is undertaken with the government. From this dialogue, indigenous peoples requested to have a much tighter relationship with the UN system and representatives of Afro-descending peoples to accompany the implementation of this. Since they took part in the design, the idea was to accompany the implementation of the cooperation framework to be able to keep a continuous political dialogue around the central topics. Well, the pandemic hit us in the midst of this process. However, we were able to establish consultation and dialogue mechanisms to produce the analysis of the socioeconomic impact in order to face COVID-19. Indigenous peoples expressed their concern, what they needed, and the impact that the pandemic was having on indigenous population, in particular in relation to access to food, access to healthcare services, and the fact that most of the economically active population is informal. Most of the indigenous population is like that, so they have no access to the social protection programs coming from the government. So they proposed some solutions. They shared a document where they included their proposals to strengthen community economy in order to have a better management of the pandemic and its economic impact on the different peoples. Also strengthen financial systems and create programs that strengthen financial programs, community activities, especially in the case of small-sized growers. And those proposals were taken into account in the socio-economic response plan of the UN. The proposal of indigenous peoples highlighted the importance of setting up service networks in the communities, and also what ancestral medicine could offer. So the idea was to facilitate some encounters between the indigenous authorities and the Ministry of Health. There are some communities that are not having access to healthcare services. And so they wanted this relationship with the authorities, so as those services to be able to reach indigenous communities.
Well, we have continued with this dialogue, and we've had a big disaster because of the storms and hurricanes that have gone through Central America, and indigenous peoples have also included the analysis of the impact of these storms and hurricanes so that we can have an updated version. so that we can include some of the socio-economical responses given that context too. So this is the situation, trying to strengthen the engagement, the relationship with the indigenous peoples and the United Nations system. So we have put together an interagency work task to try and provide support to the United Nations team in order to establish continuous political and systematic dialogue with the main stakeholders, indigenous peoples, and the United Nations system. So on the second column here, you can see some of the tasks that the task force has to undertake. So to try and close this, some of the ancestral authorities represented here are only representing one part, but they have presented a proposal for engagement and relationship with indigenous peoples and the different agencies. We're going to put together a counter proposal that will include the largest diversity possible of indigenous peoples here in Guatemala. As you know, indigenous peoples are not homogeneous at all. We have quite a diversity, including diversity of languages and dialogues. So we want to include the largest possible diversity of indigenous peoples in the country. And we've had conversations with a special repertoire from an expert talking about these topics. And this has been an important contribution, having this special presenter address the indigenous people leaders. Now, if we talk about priorities in order to achieve an inclusion and to have there's some progress towards the 2020 agenda, work with the indigenous peoples is critical and fundamental. It is important to put together a participation that not only includes indigenous peoples at a programmatic level, but also to consider the knowledge and the practices that indigenous peoples have. This must not only be included in our schedule and our programming, but we must always keep this space for dialogue as something permanent at a political level, trying to promote the conversation and the dialogue between indigenous peoples, the government, and other sectors in society too. They really value that because in Guatemala, dialogue between different sectors has always been difficult given the political tensions, the political polarization, but given these engagement system with the United Nations is seen as an opportunity to facilitate this dialogue, that the United Nations can facilitate this dialogue between the private sector, indigenous peoples, and the government, among other stakeholders. There are many challenges that we need to face, not only with the socioeconomic recovery given the pandemic, but also moving towards the SDGs, which is not going to be possible if we do not include indigenous peoples at the different level of decision making and seeing them not only as beneficiaries. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Arias, for sharing with us the view of Guatemala, the dialogue with indigenous peoples, and showing us some of the measures that you're taking in order to have a more ongoing engagement and relationship with indigenous peoples, trying to establish a dialogue with different parts of the society, and also the examples that you have given us in order to improve access to social services. So thank you so much for all of that. We are getting questions regarding your presentation. We are going to tell these people that we are going to share it with them. So Rebecca, let me now leave the floor to Jessica Fayeta. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here. I would like to greet the Vice President Choquehuanca, also the Vice Minister Acevedo, Christian Salazar, and Raúl García Buchaca, my colleagues, Elizabeth, Rebecca Arias, my colleagues from the United Nations Resident Coordinator, all of the representatives representatives from Latin America and the Caribbean that are here in this important event for the region with us today. Colombia, the UN team in Colombia has worked for some time very closely with the organizations of indigenous peoples in Colombia, in particularly ONIC and also OPIAC in Colombia, which is the organization for representing the indigenous peoples in the Amazons. Our work has been quite broad. The relationship has also been very close. But today I want to concentrate on the work that we did and the support that we have provided in socioeconomic response given the COVID situation, providing support and adding on top of what the Colombian government has done and what other countries in the region have also been given to Colombia. I am speaking here on behalf of three teams in the country, not only Colombia, sorry, also Peru, and I'm also talking on behalf of Brazil because it was the three resident coordinators that we worked together to try and put our efforts in the area of the triple frontier between Colombia, Brazil, and Peru, where unfortunately there was an important outbreak and infection point in May of this terrible virus. I do want to say that the characteristics of the Amazons immediately became a disadvantage for the population of the people in this triple frontier, especially the indigenous people. The Amazons is an important road for supplying goods to many people in the whole continent. And these areas have over 400 indigenous communities in this triple frontier area. And the virus spread throughout the river. In May, there were as many cases per capita as in New York. In the case of Colombia, it was 20 or 20 times fives more than the national prevalence. And that affected, as the case has been for many other populations, it affected the elderly. And in the case of indigenous people, this was also a matter of concern because but by having many of the elderly people affected, many of them passed away, and with them, their ancestral knowledge also started disappearing. So this was something that was a matter of concern for all of us. So we started undertaking some actions in to try and reinforce what the governments were already doing. One of the first actions, we sent out a multi-sectorial help launched by the humanitarian team from Colombia in May. And we established a coordination point in the city of Leticia in order to facilitate a follow-up and response. And the three teams together developed an action plan that contained 25 points to implement coordinated actions and to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic, more specifically concentrated on indigenous peoples. For this, the plan considered an estimated cost of $10 million for it to be implemented, and that was the basis for us to start moving resources. Well, let's say that the promotion of these cross-border initiatives between the different residents and the teams from the United Nations came up as quite a promising strategy to start addressing issues in general of indigenous people given their poverty and their complex context that they have, especially in these three countries. So the three teams were coordinated trying to execute some actions in the area. In Colombia, for example, 5 new partners provided emergency response, giving over 40 tons of food, hygiene kits also in the first few weeks. So this was a multi-sectorial response that included the support to epidemiological surveillance and the supply of health-related products in order to address the situation. Then the World Vision hospital ship in Brazil and in Colombia, and in cooperation with other NGOs, Sumate in particular, was also key to help or to aid many of the communities throughout the riverbanks. It was important for us to use this waterway between Manaus, Iquitos, where the most important cities of Tabatinga, for example, are, Leticia also on the Peruvian side. So we mobilized resources jointly, and Colombia received through the Central Emergency Fund received money, and that was used for the action plan on the Colombian side. And one of the most unfortunate challenges, which is important to mention, is that we wanted to mobilize some emergency funds also for Peru and Brazil, but we were not able to achieve them in spite of the urgent needs and in spite of the work that we carried out at the regional level. And this is because these are countries that are considered with a middle income level, including Colombia too. Yet when we see the big inequalities existing, especially uh, the concentration of poverty, in particular among indigenous peoples, they represent 14% of poverty, 70% of people in extreme poverty. Therefore, that just goes to show the difference and also the inability of having access to these emergency funds in spite of the needs that they have. Now, having said this, there are good news too. They need to be mentioned. The cases did decrease. There was an important approach, and we hope to have contributed to have a contribution in decreasing the number of infections and cases. Yet, the new strain P1, which is known, which is more infectious and which has been confirmed in the Brazilian Amazons in January, is also a source of concern. And it is also contributing towards a negative impact in the region. Over 2/3 of the population had antibodies, and this is not only to the infection because of the infection, but also because of the help that they received from their governments. A second outbreak in December affected the area even harder than it did at the beginning before the spring 2020, and we have seen the impact of this new strain in Manaus, Brazil, and also in the Amazon state in Peru, and with a full use of the ICU units and beds. Many people started showing the infection rates grew without having ICU units or beds available. And we know that there has been up and down in spite of the efforts that the governments have undertaken. And one of the most important priorities that we have now is vaccinations. I would like to close by saying that the priorities from now on should be supporting quick recovery in this area and intensifying the efforts for the mobilization of resources that we need for this area. We need to improve a consultation between the indigenous peoples, and we need to put together specific plans. And humanitarian teams and the teams from the United Nations, from the countries, will continue providing a multi-sectorial supplementary response to this important part of the region, and also for the indigenous Amazon people in our region. Thank you so much, and forgive me for having gone over time.
Thank you very much. This is a very concrete example of what we called the emergency mode development. We're still in emergency because of the figures you mentioned and the importance of this across-the-board effort, which is part of the reform of the UNs. But now we see it in action, highlighting the need of continuing mobilizing resources. We know it is a big challenge for our region to obtain funds to give a response. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Now we're going to close. In order to go back to the plenary meeting, I'm going to give the floor.
Ah, perdón, sí, es con Paulo.
Sí,
Perdón,
es
Paulo.
Paula, es Paula
No,
con la-
we continue with Paulo. You're right. Sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. Distinguished panel members, representatives of government, representatives of indigenous peoples, colleagues from the UN system, representatives of multilateral agencies and of the civil society. First of all, I would like to congratulate the panelists for their great interventions, which is so important in terms of the inclusion of the indigenous peoples and the 2030 agenda. When listening to you, we assert that one of the main challenges faced by the countries of the region is to build institutionally diverse society, which are inclusive, equitable, and non-discriminatory, where the rights of indigenous peoples are recognized and guaranteed. So we have to renew strategic alliances with indigenous peoples, states, and agencies for cooperation. Just as our Agenda Secretary said, the Agenda 2030 is a big opportunity for that. And it is reinforced and supplemented by other intergovernmental agreements adopted by the member states, amongst them Montevideo Consensus and the Conference for Latin America and the Caribbean, that includes a lot of priority measures aiming at indigenous people, specifically in relation to territory, health, combat violence, political participation, and the generation of information. All of that within the framework of the standards of individual and collective rights of those peoples. It is indispensable to establish political and technical synergies in order to speed up the commitments agreed on. As it was said in this panel, pre-existing inequalities to the pandemic have affected indigenous people because they have vulnerabilities and threats. And it's been demonstrated once more the resilience of indigenous peoples and their important capacity of organization by activating contention and mitigation measures that are autonomous, deploying strategies of reciprocity, self-care, and epidemiological surveillance, and giving an example to the world of collective responses vis-a-vis those global crises. Before closing my brief intervention, I would like to mention some of the recommendations regarding the mitigation of the impact of the pandemic so as to have a transformational recovery. All of this is in the interagency report that was mentioned on the impact of COVID-19 on indigenous peoples of Latin America. I think this is pretty much in agreement with what was said in this panel. It is crucial for policies of recovery highlight the collective rights of indigenous peoples and that there is participation and consultation in order to obtain a free consent, informed consent in terms of any measure that could affect them, and also including the participation of women and young indigenous people. It is important to propose solutions based on the nature from the territorial rights, where forests play a decisive role in the climate mitigation action, something that is done at a regional, local, and world level. National governments, international community, and other players should strengthen their collaboration with indigenous people in order to improve the governance of their territories and ensure territorial collective rights. All of this is key to develop sustainable strategies. It is fundamentally important to strengthen the production of disaggregated information on indigenous peoples in such a way to be able to assess socioeconomic impacts of the crisis and follow-up of national actions and the fulfillment of the objectives of the Agenda 2030 and other national international commitments. And finally, we have to learn from experience and revert the structural causes of the crisis. In that process, the review of the concept of good living applied by the indigenous peoples, it is an opportunity to construct more new models, more people-centered, and establish new social and political pacts that lay the foundations to build a welfare state where the plurinational character of Latin American countries is recognized. Once again, I thank the panel members for their excellent presentations, and I thank all of you who have been with us. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor. Ahora le paso la palabra
Thank
a
you
la presentadora.
very much.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, gracias a los panelistas también, a ti, Elizabeth.
Thanks to the panel members, thanks to Elizabeth, thanks to the colleague who have started this event. I've seen the figures. People continue to join the seminar even after the hour. I mean, we had been raising the number of participants, so this topic is very interesting. I recognize that there were several resident coordinators connected, people from the offices, representatives of several UN agencies, political department, high commissioner. So, well, because they work in those countries, and it is important for them to be here because the change will happen in the country, in the community. So it is important to have this audience. I'm very proud. I'm very proud that so many coordinators from different countries set aside some time and we're here. I hope Raúl, Paulo, and others maybe we could think of other events together with the High Commissioner of the Human Rights and others about this topic, because we have to continue open fora on the situation with indigenous people, with the government of the region. I think this is what we should do in the midst of this crisis. Not sufficient attention is being given to indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants in this crisis. Well, there are so many problems, but I think we have to give them more visibility. And this is something we can do together. This is not only important today, and our colleagues from ECLEX maybe are wiser and know better, but just see the economic data. And when there is economic recovery, when the pressure for economic growth and to reduce the fiscal space happens, there will be pressure on indigenous lands and rights. That wouldn't be surprising. We have fought for many years regarding rights and previous consultation. Well, now it is so important to get together and see that some of those few rights are not lost. So thank you. Thank you for taking your time. Thank you for your collaboration.
Si se menciona uno y no otro que ha hecho.
Well, if you mention one and not the others, well, it's a bit risky, but thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we will continue on this because this is part of our work. It's part of our responsibility to open more spaces in that regard. Vice Minister, thank you very much for being here. I think we can do more things for the reasons I've mentioned. Thank you very much. Elizabeth?
Muchas gracias.
You have the floor.
Bueno, hemos grabado
Thank you.
este seminario,
Thank you.
así
We
que
have recorded this seminar. So
quizás
you
en
maybe this could be uploaded.
si no, lo vamos
We
a-
will see if it is possible. If not, we're going to distribute it amongst the participants. Thank you very much.
acompañarles.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Rebecca.
Todos.
Thanks to everyone.
Gracias.
Greetings to all.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Adiós.